Good afternoon. I'm joined today by Ben Rubin. Ben has been looking at many things that have been major topics for the UK column, particularly for Deborah Evans. Areas such as the NHS, big data, data gathering, and genomics. Before we get into those issues, Ben, welcome. I'd like to start with, if you could just give our audience a little background, who you are, what your experience is, and how you came to know what you currently know.
Hi, I'm Ben Rubin. I'm a British citizen and I'm an independent strategy consultant. And I've spent the last 18 years or so working across pretty much the whole economic system, advising chiefs, so people who run companies, CEOs, and the people who run the divisions within those companies on how to move into new markets, improve operational performance, and particularly doing all of that using advanced technologies. And for the past kind of 3, 4, 5 years in particular, I've been working in and around the UK health system and spending a lot of time looking at what the NHS are doing, so reading their strategies and their future visions and where they're placing their investments. And in particular within that, looking at the introduction of things like genomics as a new type of medicine into the mainstream health system in the UK. I basically got a glimpse into the way that the system operates across the piece, right? So all of the different industry sectors were digitizing. In order to digitize or to help organizations digitize, you have to go in and understand how they run, the different systems and processes that they employ. Fundamentally, what are they doing? How do they make money? What are the ownership structures that they use? And basically going across the whole piece and looking into all the different components of the 21st century digitized, globalized, automated economic system. And in the early days, a lot of that was very much focused on the kind of less sensitive parts of the system. So things like media, the music industry, newspapers and magazines, all that kind of thing, the more kind of consumer facing stuff. But as time went on, the more sensitive industries, the more sensitive parts of the system began to digitize. And actually for the past kind of 5, 6, 7 years in particular, that's really been biting into healthcare and the way that care is delivered, not just in this country, but everywhere internationally. And, we've seen these advanced technologies have an enormous impact already, but they are projected to really kind of fundamentally take over, actually, the way that, and dictate how things like healthcare are delivered. And I find that extremely concerning.
It is astonishing, the change. I mean, in my lifetime, my son earns his crust coding, writing software, and creating things with computers. Now, when I want to make him laugh, I tell him about my early experiences with computers. So just one generation. I was in the computing club at school. Computing club at school had no computers. We wrote code longhand and put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it. And it was sent by post to Hamilton Teacher Training College, who had a mainframe. And someone then typed it into the mainframe, ran it, and whatever output you got, put it in an envelope and posted it back. So that was how it was done. And that was the 80s. So we've come a very, very, very long way in a very short time. When we come to matters relating to the most sensitive areas of healthcare in the NHS, this is an area that Debbie Evans has been talking about for some time. So she's seeing certain themes which she feels are vitally important. So one is the data gathering potential of the NHS. Because of the unique nature of the NHS, whether you like it or hate it or feel both simultaneously, the data gathering potential of the NHS, because it is this huge state-funded, apart from the Chinese army, I think the largest employer in the world, huge organisation, and everybody's a part of it in the whole country. They can gather data like no other organisation anywhere in the world, including the United States, is able to do. So you've got that. You've then got genomics coming in, providing information on the individual in a way that's entirely new. You've got that then promoting or directing or inspiring big pharma to bring in new products for new forms of profit. And this forms a kind of Bermuda Triangle of problems, because in this area you've got the profit motive, but you've got state-run organisations. So you've got this interaction between the private sector and the public sector, where choice disappears, where consent tends to disappear. So you have all of the problems of bureaucratic and authoritarian and totalitarian states, with the added impetus of large corporations seeking to make enormous sums of money. Debbie sees this as a tremendous threat to the people of Britain, and sees it as the avenue where problematic treatments, ill thought out ideas are going to be delivered at a pace that will prevent proper scrutiny and prevent people making informed choices. I hope when she sees this, she thinks I've put her case well. Do you think that sort of problem that I've outlined to you is real? And if you do, could you start to pick away at the ideas and information that led you to that position?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that Debbie's completely correct. Actually, yeah. It's a fundamental threat. Actually, I see it as a fundamental threat to not just the British people, but actually the whole global population. I think it's a threat to humanity, because the nature of digital platform businesses, let's just call them, is that they can be global very quickly and very efficiently. And the ambition of people building technology-enabled businesses, and they are primarily businesses enabled by a very compliant state, as you pointed out, is their strategy is to become as big as they possibly can. So essentially, what they're looking to do is to create data-enabled, genomics-focused, revenue and profit-generating organizations, and to create a new marketplace, essentially, on top of our health system. And the reason, as you pointed out, that they're able to do that particularly effectively and easily and quickly in the UK is partly to do with the nature of the NHS. As you said, it's a single integrated system. You mentioned America as another example. Actually, it's incredibly difficult in America to do the kind of thing that our health leaders, as they nominally call themselves, are doing, because there's so much fragmentation in the system. It's delivered primarily through the private sector. Most of those organizations, whether that's individual doctors or health systems or insurance providers, don't talk to each other. In fact, they're competing with each other to a certain extent. So there's no incentive, or there hasn't been much incentive for them to share information to build these data platforms. Whereas in the UK, we've been building patient data platforms for several decades now. I mean, probably since the 80s, we've had fairly well-developed IT capabilities inside the NHS, and we've been gathering, whoever's interacted with the health system, we've been gathering their data, ever more and ever more sensitive amounts of data from the population. And it's absolutely it is kind of a perfect storm, right? Because you've got the NHS, which can effectively mandate this stuff, right? Because everyone is a patient of the NHS. Most of us are born in NHS hospitals, so right from birth, essentially, they have an opportunity to to tag you and bag you and take your information. And they have been doing that for a long time, but now the type of information that they can take is much more sensitive. So they're already talking about putting genomics, blood testing, taking blood samples into the neonatal pathway, right? So actually, when you're a newborn, one of the first things that will happen to you is they'll take a blood sample that will go off sequencing, and then that data would exist on your permanent health record. It's something that can be looked at and interrogated by people who have the ability to do that. But they're actually looking at doing in vitro testing now. And actually, as I understand it, they've already done a bunch of in vitro testing. So they're taking blood samples from children who haven't been born yet and are using that to generate genomic sequences and to put that into their database and to run experiments across it, essentially. Yeah. So the NHS has been a really important part of this. It is marketed as such internationally, right? And some of the partnerships that are in place, particularly with Palantir, who you're probably familiar with. This is the data analytics business that was founded by Peter Thiel, who was one of the PayPal crowd, and then also the earliest outside investor in Facebook. Very rich man, very smart man. His business, Palantir, has cut a deal, which I believe was awarded without any kind of proper procurement process, to build a single integrated data platform that pulls together all of the disparate pieces of information that exist across all the different NHS IT systems, because there is still some work to be done to properly integrate all of that stuff. Palantir is a private sector provider. They work with global corporations. They work a lot across the pharmaceutical industry, and they also work with our NHS. We're paying them $500 million, I think it is, to do this data integration project. So that's going on in the background. Also the regulatory environment has been manipulated, I believe, to be conducive to enabling the systems. And actually, if you read, really eye-opening, actually. And most people don't go and read government policy on anything. They just assume that it's fine, someone somewhere is checking this stuff to make sure that actually the policies that are being enacted are in the best interests of the population that's paying for them. But if you go and read the Life Sciences Bill from 2021, essentially what's being described in there is, well, first of all, an industry. Yeah, so actually the health system is being described by Boris Johnson, as it was at the time. But, the entire clinical and academic and pharmaceutical establishment in this country and internationally, rather than talking about our health system as a way of primarily improving the health and well-being of the British people, which is what it should be there to do, it's actually talked about in terms of an industry and a market. Right. So all of the headline messages are about the relaxation of regulation, the alignment between regulatory bodies and industry and the political classes, and how streamlined everything is becoming, and how quick it is to market your drugs in the UK health system. They boast about the levels of inward investment that the life sciences industry has been receiving. And obviously all of this, remarkably, is positioned in the context of the World Economic Forum's Build Back Better initiative, which is referenced in the life sciences strategy, in the opening statement from Boris Johnson, and a couple of more times through the document. And that was released in 2021. And actually looking at that, I think, tells you everything that you need to know about the situation that we've been in, and the situation as it appears to be developing, that I in a way that I don't personally think is sustainable.
Just to illustrate to our audience, one of the issues you raised there, which was the introduction of DNA testing, genetic testing into the neonatal pathway in the NHS. We've got here an announcement from NHS England dated the 12th of October 2022, so pretty recent. World first national genetic testing service to deliver rapid life-saving checks for babies and kids. I think they don't mean baby goats, but still. The NHS, they write, will be able to diagnose and potentially save the lives of thousands of severely ill children and babies within days rather than weeks, with a world first national genetic testing service launching today. Announcing the groundbreaking new service, the first ever NHS Genomics Conference in England, NHS Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard hailed it as the start of a new era in genomic medicine. The new service will be based in Devon and will rapidly process DNA samples of babies and children who end up seriously ill in hospital or who are born with a rare disease such as cancer. So it's not at this point every child, but I take your point. It always starts with the wedge issues and the seriously unwell infants and newborns. Something obviously gets a lot of sympathy, and people rather are not looking at potential problems when you're dealing with that sort of subject area. So that's just from October last year. Now, the nature of the NHS is something that we debate quite a lot on the column, and each one of us have probably got different views. They overlap a fair bit, but we've all got different views as to just what it is and where it's going. And the phrase privatisation comes up, and you talked there about profit motives and companies, making very substantial amounts of money to propel the NHS in a certain direction. The danger that I see in terms of an organisation like the NHS is the government interaction with the private sector, because you're taking out the one thing that disciplines the private sector. Why is the private sector so much more efficient than government? Well, it's because if it's not, it goes out of business, because someone better will come along. So the competition keeps it honest. And what are they competing for? They're competing for business. So they go into the customer and say, we'll try harder, we'll do better. And ultimately the customer's king, because the customer, everyone's going to vote every time they have a pound. And the customer chooses. And that has its downsides, right? Because you're dealing with the masses of men and the problems with the masses of men. But it does mean that there's an ultimate arbiter which is not controllable, that is going to make a decision in their own best interests, and it means that the private sector ultimately has to serve the public. Now, there's lots of attempts to make it otherwise, there's lots of attempts to manipulate the public, there's lots of attempts to set up cartels, all of which fail. Because you've got this bedrock of the basic game is you have to serve the public so that they'll come back and buy your product or service again. If you introduce coercive taxation as a means of generating money, so essentially the government's pointing a gun at your head and say, you give us your money or you go to jail, we'll ruin your life. That's one of the major areas of choice is gone. And then when you have a large centrally controlled organisation so that there's physically no choice in the country, the rest of the choice is gone. You couple the profit motive to that degree of power, you get something else. It's called privatisation, but it's not privatisation. It's a fascist system where you have private profits, but the private companies are directed by the state. This is a German Nazi system. This is a fascist system. And it's not nationalised as we understand it. It's not privatised either. It's the third way. Do you see that particular interaction as especially a threat?
Yes, and you're right, it is fascist. It's the technical definition of fascism as laid out by Mussolini. It is enabling and encouraging appalling behaviours. What we're looking at is essentially corporate state capture. So actually the interests of the corporations are the primary concern of the state. and actually all of the things that I've just described in terms of the preparation of the marketplace that is the health system by the Tory government and and a whole bunch, not just the Tory government, a whole bunch of other people in this ecosystem surrounding it, is geared up primarily towards helping large international companies, investment funds to make money. And that is almost certainly to the detriment of what they're supposed to be doing, which is to be protecting and improving the health of the nation.
One of the aspects of this which I've noticed most strongly is that when you take this sort of system, this odd hybrid third way system, and it takes good ideas and it kind of twists them. Right? So an example would be in education, which is run on a similar basis in Britain for the most part. If you take they were realizing we've got a problem. Quality's down, enthusiasm's down, morale's down, and we're not really achieving what we should be achieving here. So we need to improve. So they looked to the private sector and they said, okay, right, we've got this thing called total quality management, and it's revolutionized Japanese automotive industry, and it's being used a lot. So we're going to bring that in. So they brought all the ideas of total quality management. So this is small tests of change, a cycle of coming up with an idea, putting it into action, reviewing it, and then deciding again, and having an iterative approach to continuous improvement. Okay. But they got one thing tragically wrong. They didn't view the child and its parents and the family as the customer. They viewed the child as the product. The customer was the state. So we went from being how to better serve people to treating people as though they are literally gears in a gearbox, to be improved and made standardized. So all of these good ideas, which worked well, were subverted by a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were trying to do. And this idea, who's the customer, because ultimately in these situations, the customer's always the state, because the state enables the profit. So what the state wants, the state gets. And it kind of takes everything and somehow makes it a kind of Frankenstein's monster instead of a beautiful human being. It puts all the pieces back together, but they're not quite right. Is that something you recognise?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, like the life sciences strategy, that document it describes a market. It describes a state-enabled industry, biotechnological industry, that is geared towards profit making for UK PLC, but also international partners. That's the discussion. That's what they're talking about. And as you kind of rightly pointed out, the individual, the citizen, the person that all this is supposed to be on behalf of, is essentially discussed as like a raw material in the production process. They're not a beneficiary. They're a unit to be tracked and manipulated and experimented on, and a kind of secondary in that regard. They're like a natural resource for the system, as opposed to being, the primary focus of, all the primary beneficiary of what's going on. And you used a really interesting term there, which is this idea of the kind of Frankenstein's monster. And that's actually what genomics is seeking to do, right? This idea that somehow we come into this world inherently flawed, and it's within the gift of these scientists, and these business people to analyze us and know us at a molecular level, and then prescribe experimental interventions. Yeah, they actually want to go in and edit your genomic sequence. That's what these technologies are designed to do. It's what they're capable of doing. And to do that at an industrial scale across the entire population, and to do it using the technologies that have driven this fourth industrial revolution that we've all been part of, subjected to over the past few years. And actually, if you look at, one of the most interesting developments, and actually it's one of the reasons that I reached out to you to have this conversation, one of the most interesting things that I've seen in this space over the past couple of months is a strategic partnership that's just been announced between Moderna and IBM, which was announced in mid-April. And essentially what this means is that Moderna, who specialize in RNA products, and in fact, before the COVID pandemic hit, had never actually marketed any kind of product. So they'd never produced a pharmaceutical. It was just all speculative, experimental innovation that they've been doing. And COVID presented them with an opportunity to become extremely big, extremely quickly, and to make a whole lot of money. Obviously, as they were doing that, there's been a whole bunch of human damage that's been caused, right, while they've been making their money. But let's put that aside for the moment. But what is that business now doing? What's the next phase that it sees in its development into an ever larger, ever more profitable, ever more systemically significant pharmaceutical business? Because that's what it is. It's to sign a deal with IBM so that they can use a new tool that IBM have created, which is a generative AI tool. So this is like an industrialized version of like a Chat GPT. And I'm sure that many of your viewers will be familiar with Chat GPT. It's all that a lot of people have been talking about for the past 6 months plus. Essentially what it does is it produces new content based on inputs that you put into the system, but it's generative. Yeah. So what IBM and Moderna are seeking to do through this alliance is to use that artificial intelligence that's been created by IBM to generate new genomic data, new genomic information that can then be inserted into the patient by Moderna using their experimental chemicals that they're going to create on the back of this AI-generated material. And I just think that is unbelievably sinister. The idea that we would allow machines, computers, to re-engineer human code is that's dystopian stuff that I don't think that even I had even thought we would get to this point. Even having watched what's happened over the past couple of years, but that is what they are doing. That's what they're building. That's what this marketplace has been set up to enable. And that is what sits at the absolute centre of NHS strategy, UK government life sciences and healthcare strategy, and all of the associated stuff that goes with that, right? Including how we're training clinicians, how we're funding research, what the academic institutions are doing. So kind of like deep research in places like Oxford and Cambridge, for example. All of it, or significant amounts of it, is geared towards enabling this system, building these algorithms to interrogate people's genomic data and then to make recommendations about how to edit it and to improve it based on whatever it is that these scientists come up with. And it's actually, I find it horrific, to look at this and to understand the mindset, really, because as I said on that Dellingpod interview, I'm a trustee of a public health charity called Public Health Collaboration, and nothing that I'm saying here or doing around these issues, particularly as it relates to genomics, has got anything to do with PHC. It's purely focused on improving the metabolic health of the nation. But through that position, it's been made clear to me, and I've seen the evidence, that you could address most of the chronic issues that we face, the chronic health issues that we face as a nation, through making simple changes to diet and exercise. Yeah, so things like ultra high processed foods, for example, we shouldn't be eating those. We need to lead much less sedentary lives. There's a whole bunch of issues in terms of things like the way that we use technology. but also overprescribing and the kind of like this constant drive to pharmaceutically treat illness, which is the default position of Western medicine, is basically, that is really the root cause of a lot of the problems. So actually, rather than investing in big data analytics, artificial intelligence platforms to go around sniffing out opportunities to algorithmically interfere with people's genetic codes, there's probably some exponentially cheaper and simpler things that could be done to have a transformational impact on society that would, I mean, really change quality of life in this nation. But no one in the medical establishment, no one in the political system, certainly no one in the genomics industry, whether they're the actual operators or the investors or any of the other participants in that space, no one in that space is interested in having that conversation, because it would mean that they then don't have their golden goose to lay golden eggs for them for the next however long, and until the next iteration of whatever hellish industrialized health initiatives are coming down the pipe next, whatever they've got cooked up for 5 years, 10 years down the track, when they've reaped the profits of all of these new things that they've built using the profits generated by COVID vaccines. And that's the situation we're looking at.
The aspect of this where we're looking at a great deal, not just human greed, but a great deal of human arrogance, is a bit worrying as well, because we've seen the medical industrial complex as we know it before COVID and mRNA vaccines and genomics became a thing. We've seen them produce drugs like thalidomide. We've seen them endorse smoking tobacco as one of the best things you can do for your health. And, trust your doctor, because he smokes Camel cigarettes. We've seen a situation where even under their analysis, the death caused by medical intervention is the third leading cause of death in the West after heart disease and cancer. And the number one constituent part of that is correctly prescribed medicines. Not things that are given in error, not medicines that are taken in overdose quantities. Correctly prescribed medicines killing people. This is the biggest contributor. So we've seen enough to have awareness of the of at least some of the announcements and prescriptions of the medical profession, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry. That we've seen in vaccines and in the search for viruses to generate the next opportunity for medical intervention. Major problems, major catastrophes, not often discussed in the mainstream media, but well documented, and areas where, such as the AIDS scare, where the official narrative and the facts just don't align. We add into that DNA, where up until very recently, most of the human genome was called junk DNA. It was junk. It didn't do anything. And piece by piece, we're now learning, no, it's not junk. It does do things. So clearly the level of knowledge is very much substandard. But we're handing over to this complex of organisations all of this potential power to do harm. It's a bit worrying. Now, so what's the solution? A lot of people would say regulation. Through the COVID crisis, we've been paying a lot of attention to the MHRA, the regulator of choice in the UK. Whenever you ask any of the government agencies about safety of, for example, COVID-19 vaccines, they all point to the MHRA. They know. And when you go to the MHRA, it's not a very impressive response. How do you see the position of regulators in this area, with reference to genomic science and with reference to big data?
It's a really good question. I think so. I'll touch on a couple of things. I think that the first thing to say is that, and actually, I spent a couple of years really looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms and understanding, to the best of my knowledge, because this is complicated stuff, right? And I'm not a developer or a coder. I don't write these algorithms. My main focus is understanding what kind of how they work and what they can actually do. And then like ethical issues around how they should be deployed, particularly as it relates to gathering citizen data, which is a point you touched on earlier. And the general consensus, particularly even from the people operating at the top level of this space, which is an emergent space, is that the regulator has absolutely no clue how to regulate this stuff, and they don't even understand the technology. And what you're probably looking at is something a little bit like what happened, particularly happened in 2008 with the financial crisis, where you had the banks coming up with these novel financial instruments that no one, probably even them, really understood, but just seemed to deliver lots of money to them. So, hey, let's run with it. And we all know what happened there. We had a collapse in the global financial system. We're probably looking at a similar situation here today with artificial intelligence, right? I mean, the regulator in particular isn't quick enough, isn't fast enough, doesn't understand the technology well enough, and is just playing catch up constantly while people in the private sector are off building these things and creating a regulatory environment where they can go and deploy them, and all that kind of stuff's going on in the background. So that's part of it. Regulators don't really understand it, and then the MHRA in particular, it's difficult to say whether they are compromised or just completely incompetent. But the net outcome is basically the same thing, right? Which is that they've done an appalling job, particularly over the past 3 years, and I mean, and probably for some time before that. It's just that it's only the last 3 years that's really thrust them into the spotlight, given the visibility and importance of the stuff that they've been advising on, right? Whether that's COVID vaccines or genomics, as we're talking about. And I would draw your viewers' attention to two things here, right? The first is, well, actually, no. Let's look at three things. The first one is a great article that was on UK Column by someone called Hedley Rees in May this year, where he attended. I believe it's a he, may not be. I'm not familiar with the name Hedley. Sounds like a guy. He attended a presentation by the MHRA to talk about how fantastic they are, as they generally do. And actually what he saw and what we read about was a whole bunch of basically removing of guardrails around the development of pharmaceutical treatments. Yeah, so even to the point of in now the MHRA will do remote factory inspections, where an individual in the regulator will sit at their desk and they will have a video stream like the one you and I are on now, David, rather than going in person to a factory to inspect the quality, to make sure that all the appropriate controls are in place, to make sure that the regulations are being followed as they should be, to shake the hands of the people that work there, to look them in the eye, to gauge the, that kind of intuitive sense that we have that something is right or isn't right. Like, all of that stuff has now just been taken away, and it's perfectly fine apparently for UK healthcare regulators to never even go to a production facility that's producing pharmaceuticals that are going to go into our supply chain. Yeah, and that's just one example of the way that the regulatory environment's been degraded. There's also a fantastic video that I only watched a couple of days ago by Professor Norman Fenton, where he analyzes a speech by June Rain, who is the CEO of the MHRA. And basically, she's up there talking about how fantastic the MHRA yellow card scheme is, actually. So she's talking about how great this piece of technology is, or this system that we have for tracking adverse events to drugs when they've been administered to people, as you mentioned. It's actually one of the main causes of death in the health system is pharmaceuticals. So it's really important for us to understand when people are dying or when people are being injured, particularly when it's new drugs going out into the market, like the COVID vaccines. And if you're following this program, you probably know that COVID vaccination has caused more injury and more death than all other drugs combined in the history of yellow card reporting. I mean, the red flags coming out of that system have been impossible to miss, impossible to ignore over the past 3 years, and yet the MHRA have not just ignored them. June Rain, in this video that's looked at by Norman Fenton, is essentially standing up and communicating actual statistics that have come out of the system, but is basically describing them as a good. Yeah, so actually we got this system for tracking injuries and deaths from novel pharmaceuticals, but when the system tells us that the novel pharmaceuticals are killing and injuring people, we're going to ignore it. So actually the system isn't being used in the way it's supposed to be being used. And then we're also going to present that data as somehow some kind of success on our part. And from my perspective, that's just it's clearly deeply dishonest. But my view is that the medical establishment, clinical establishment, is essentially engaged in a mass gaslighting operation against the British population right now. Yeah, so that's the second point. And then the third point, and again, this is one of the reasons why I reached out to get in touch with you, is that Genomics England has just entered into a strategic partnership with the MHRA to use genomics data as a way of projecting potential adverse events in future use of novel pharmaceuticals. So we've got two government-aligned or government-controlled entities, yeah. So MHRA and Genomics England, both of whom are deeply questionable, both in their formulation, like what they've actually been set up to do, but also how they're currently being run and the individuals at the top of those organisations and what they're there for and who they're designed to serve, which appears to be industry and the city, yeah, as opposed to the British population, coming together to create a new turbo whiz next generation yellow card reporting scheme, despite the fact that for the past 3 years, we've been ignoring all of the safety data that's been coming out of the existing yellow card reporting scheme, caused by novel pharmaceuticals using RNA technology, which is one of the fundamental components of the genomics ecosystem. It's absolutely remarkable, and I can only read it as I think it's basically about message building and narrative and communication, and the people at the top level of the health system, and this is all of them across the piece, particularly the politicians, but like the whole establishment, as far as I can tell, are perfectly happy to go out in public and present things that are knowingly damaging, and to reveal data that, in any sane assessment, should have stopped these things happening. And to present this stuff as a good thing, and that this is the only and unavoidable forward direction that we're going to take across healthcare, and it's all about saving lives, despite the fact that all the data we're showing you demonstrates that we aren't saving lives, we're actually damaging lives. And they're basically relying on the fact that large swathes of the population don't understand what they're talking about. It's a big part of it. But also are just completely disengaged from and disenfranchised by the political process and the way that the system's being run, and therefore they believe that they can pretty much get away with anything, and that's kind of what I think that we're looking at right now.
These are excellent points. I mean, the double-mindedness that the MHRA continues to show over the yellow card scheme is a sight to behold, because when people go to them and say, look, this is the data on the yellow card scheme, look at how many deaths, this is more deaths, more serious harm than has been caused by every vaccine, every medication you've ever had traced on this system. And this is just in the COVID-19 vaccination. This must require action. This is a red flag. They turn around and attack their own system. They say, oh, there's a yellow card system. Anyone can post to that. It's not checked. It doesn't mean there's a causal link. It's not just clinicians that post it. It's ordinary members of the public. And there's all this chat to make you think the yellow card scheme data's garbage.
Yeah.
Then if you go to them and say, you're charged with protecting the public from harm and making sure pharmaceuticals are safe, how do you do that? The first thing is, oh, we've got this yellow card system, it's wonderful. And it's the same person with both these opinions, and they don't seem to see the contradiction. It's very, very bizarre. We've, without an awful lot of success sometimes, have written to the MHRA asking for an explanation of various things. When one of the drug companies producing COVID-19 so-called vaccinations, shots, gene therapy, correctly defined, turned around and said, yes, we are seeing some serious adverse reactions, some of them with a fatal outcome. Nice language. They mean they knew they were killing people. I wrote to the MHRA and said, look, it's now in writing from one of the pharmaceutical giants that at least some people are being killed by COVID-19 vaccination. But you're saying that it's still correct that we roll this out to the whole population. In fact, we should extend it to children. You're saying that because you say that the benefits outweigh the harms. So since you're actually killing people, you must have really good data to back that statement up. It must be really hard statistical proof that the benefits outweigh the harm. Can I please see the statistical risk, the quantitative risk assessment? And I'm still waiting. That was 2021, I think I asked that question, and I'm still waiting on an answer 2 years later. Because there is no answer, because there's no risk assessment, because it just doesn't exist. When you look at the decision to extend vaccinations, COVID-19 vaccinations to children who were at no risk from COVID-19, but who had been harmed in the trials, how the MHRA could sign off on that is a mystery to me. I mean, how do they sleep at night? I mean, it can't all be incompetence. Some of them must know the degree of risk they're taking. Or do they just not understand statistics? It's a very strange organisation, and it seems to be there, as you said, to promote industry interests and industry development, not to protect the public. And at any rate, having those two functions in one organisation is catastrophic to its integrity and focus, surely, I would have thought. We've been talking for nearly an hour, and I would like to go on to some other things, but we probably will need to come back to pick those up another day. I'd like to finish, if you could, since we're talking about COVID-19, if you could explain how you see COVID-19 as playing a part in all of this. How much is it been the spur to move this forward, the enabler? How big a part has COVID-19 played in this whole industry rollout into genomic science? Has it been vital?
It's a really good question. So, I mean, the science has been around for quite some time, and they've been industrializing it for some time too. So actually, Genomics England itself was announced a decade ago. It was 2013. It was introduced by Jeremy Hunt, who was then the Health Secretary, as a new entity that was going to operate in this space. So the technology was already there, the ambition was already there, but COVID-19 was really the trigger point, I think, particularly for the introduction of RNA technology into the supply chain. As you touched on, these are novel gene therapies that have been marketed as vaccines. They aren't vaccines in the traditional sense, and the government really needed a crisis I believe, in order to accelerate their introduction into mass adoption, mainstream use. And actually, we've heard people say exactly that. I can't remember who the individual was or what company they were representing, but it was at a World Economic Forum meeting, I believe, in the past couple of years. There was a senior pharmaceutical industry executive who basically said that the only reason that we've been able to get these out into the market is because of this crisis, and I absolutely believe that that's true. Yeah, I think that the fear and the terror that we were subjected to, which is reduced significantly because you can only ramp these things up for so long before people become wise and suspicious to them, was essentially a mechanism for accelerating this technology and a whole bunch of other things into society.
Yes, Ben. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been fascinating listening to you. Before you go, is there any final thoughts you would like to leave our audience with?
Any final thoughts? I think that the main thing I spend my time thinking about at the moment is how do we create parallel systems that will allow us to disengage from the mainstream systems that essentially where much of our economic, social, political, spiritual activity takes place currently. Whether that's in healthcare or anywhere else for that matter. The education system is another great example. Finance, wherever it might be. The mainstream systems have been degraded and in a way that is designed to benefit a tiny few at the expense of the mass population, and that's true absolutely everywhere. And disengaging from those systems is absolutely possible. And there are people all around this country who are doing phenomenal work on a daily basis to create new methods for delivering healthcare, new methods for delivering education, new types of economic activity that are much more focused on local people, local communities, rebuilding our national prosperity at the expense of international corporations and international investment funds. And ultimately, the success of that is going to be down to us. And it's not going to be handed to us by anyone in Westminster, anyone in the mainstream of the political system. I think that we have to opt out of it. It's a false system. It doesn't provide us with any actual choice. Doesn't fix any problems. It's actually designed, as far as I can tell, to create and perpetuate problems. And it's down to the British people, to come together and to create collective solutions that are going to carry us forward into the future and to get away from what's currently being promoted by those in power and those that are helping those in power do the things that they're doing. So that would be my final message.
Ben, until next time, thank you very much for your time.